battlefield, and the ghosts come to him, and that's why he needs the Zen master to try to quiet his very disturbed mind. In any case, if we put together a lot of these stories, it seems like Dogen is forced in a situation where he has to make peace with the samurai. His patron is a samurai, probably. If he was in trouble politically because of rival Buddhist sects in Kyoto and went to Eheiji and had the nice temple built from him there, probably that was with the support of a samurai. Then he goes all the way to Kamakura and faces the shogun. And of course, that would cause questions about karmic causality and morality and the relation between taking the moral precepts and dealing with people who are not following the precepts. So let's take a consideration of other writings about, by Dogen surrounding this event. I said he didn't leave any other writings from the event, but there are two other important writings about the event. One is a prose piece. This is on the first page of the handout, at the bottom, Travels to New Capital in Kamakura. This is part of the Eihei Koloku that Taigen, Dan Layden, and Shohaku have translated, and this version is pretty much following theirs. I might have changed a few words, but basically, this was a sermon that he gave when he got back to Eheiji. He used to give sermons at Eheiji a couple times a month, and you can see a record of all the sermons. And then there's a 6-month gap where there were no sermons in those 6 months between 1247 and 1248. So that's what makes people think, hey, he must have really done something in that period. Maybe he went to Kamakura, because why wasn't he giving regular sermons? And then we have this very interesting sermon that says he's returning, and he seems to acknowledge that the monks may have been upset. Why? Because maybe they feel he must have had a teaching in Kamakura that was different than the teaching for them. So up there in the mountains, you can have a strict teaching, follow the precepts, don't violate the morality. Maybe there's a higher ultimate truth where morality and immorality and those distinctions dissolve, but he's known as a strict follower. Maybe he has the precepts and the monastic instructions, and he also adds in koans and makes it more complicated, but he's still telling them to follow that. Maybe he hasn't quite had the incident where Gemyo is being punished so severely, but the atmosphere surrounding Dogen is that he's strict. And then he goes to Kamakura and talks to the shogun, you know, give me a break. It seems like the monks are saying to him, and he tries to reassure them, and he says, I assure you that, in the last line, my great love for the mountains is enhanced now that I've returned here. And I didn't teach them anything. I didn't say you could violate karmic causality and get away with it. I assure you of that. So it's a complicated issue for Dogen. Let's go back now to the top of that second page with the poem about the seasons. The shogun first ridicules Dogen, and then at the end he recites the poem himself. So it seemed like it made the impression. And you know, this kind of poem operates, I think, you know, in a parallel fashion to the way koans can operate, because if you don't understand the game, the rules of the game surrounding it, it does seem nonsensical. So in a few short months, Dogen was able to bring the Hojo to an understanding of that game. When I say game, I mean, you know, the context of Buddhist awakening that he's trying to support. One thing on the translation of this poem, and we can see that if you look at the English subtitles, just the first 4 lines are mentioned, basically. If you listen to the Japanese, that 5th line that has the key word here, suzushi, is mentioned. And suzushi is a word that can mean cool or cold. It can be a description of a physical phenomenon. And in some of the translations, that would be used to support the 4th line. In winter, the frozen snow. And then the 5th line would be basically, yeah, the frozen snow is cold. However, you know, it was pointed out to me by a Japanese professor when I was studying this that another way of looking at it, and if you look at the way that the term Suzushi is used in poetry from that period, it means it's cool in the same way we say that, not as a physical description, but to describe our impressions of our state of mind that we have about interesting, imaginative, thought-provoking ideas or experiences, that, hey, it's cool. And so that Suzushi here becomes a modifier not just for the fourth line, but for all four lines, and it's making a statement. I'm not sure that how pure and clear the seasons are is the best translation, but it's making a statement that each and every season in its own way is complete unto itself. And this would help to show the instruction to the shogun. And I think that's adding that part to it is important to clarify the significance of it. Since I'm keeping my own time, I guess, I'm going to wind down here by making a few other comments about Dogen's use of poetry. Well, in the Kamakura incident, we can see that he's using Japanese-style waka poetry. He's also using the narrative style of the prose comment in his sermon on his return. But he also has the third style of Chinese verse. And so let's take a look at that Chinese verse that's sandwiched in between the two Japanese verses. Again, for the historian, this kind of gives confirmation that there was a trip. For half a year, I've taken my rice in the home of a layman. Well, shows that he was doing something for 6 months. He was not eating rice at the temple, and probably Hatano was supporting him, and he was staying at Hatano's place in Kamakura. So we get that historical evidence there. The old tree's plum blossom sits amid frost and snow. Well, I have some other examples of plum blossom verses on here. I won't go into detail about it, but the plum blossom is a symbol of renewal. It's a flower that comes out in late winter. There's still snow on the branches, and the blossom is starting to bloom. So it's a sign of seasonal change. This poem would have been written around that time, late winter, early spring, when he was just before he was going to return in the third month of the year. But it also shows that he's shaking off the slumber that he went through and being forced into this compromised circumstance of teaching to the shogun. And that's what he says in the third line. And then he kind of can hear far away what's happening at the capital city, where the peach blossoms, another symbol of late winter, early spring, are just about to bloom. And he wants to go back to the capital. He doesn't go back to Kyoto because he's up in the mountains, but it's in that general vicinity in that part of Japan. And maybe he's expressing that maybe he should be in the capital because he feels that tension. Dogen has quoted in some passages a famous line that you see in the Chinese literature. A good hermit is that me? A good hermit stays in the mountains. A great hermit goes back to the city. Okay, finally, I think it's always interesting to look at Dogen's death verse. So this is on the third page, in contrast to Rujing. So the Zen masters of the period were expected to write a verse in anticipation of their death. And they were also expected to write verses that would take the verses of their mentors and modify them a little bit. So pure originality was not highly valued. What was valued was that you take the imagery of your predecessor and then you play with it and add something innovative, but not completely different. And that was part of the whole package of the so-called language game. So here we can see the different atmosphere. Rujing has a repentant atmosphere in his first line when he talks about committing terrible sins about heaven, but now he leaps beyond. And Dogen inverts that by saying he's been following the way of heaven and shattering every barrier. In both poems, they use the metaphor of the yellow springs of the netherworld as the place, the location of the dead that they're plunging into. But again, Dogen seems to shift the image from Rujing. That's not an insult to Rujing. In a way, that's a great compliment, because he took what Rujing said and then twisted it around. He twisted it around maybe in almost the opposite way from what Rujing said, but it's still part of the game of what Wu Jing is saying, so therefore it's encompassed Wu Jing. And, but it does show a kind of bravado, I think, in Dogen's version of it. And that's contrasted with what we see in a Japanese waka poem that he wrote also in anticipation of his death. So he goes back a few weeks before he dies, he leaves Eiheiji and travels back to get some medical assistance in Kyoto. And it's a difficult path because you have to go through the mountains. There was no Shinkansen at the time. You see in the Japanese verse, the first a letter of each of the lines starts with K, so that gives it a certain kind of rhythm and cadence if you're reading the Japanese verse. But it particularly draws on the sense of frailty. He's like a blade of grass. He's frail, and he's kind of getting lost in the mist of Kanobe Pass, which is an important mountain pass that he had to navigate. The earlier slide we saw was when he and his group were moving up to Kyoto 10 years earlier. Now he had to take that same pathway back from Kyoto, and we sense that frailty. That frailty also had come across to us in the poem about the moonlight, where the small boat is drifting on the previous page. So, what's the message here? Well, Dogen explored different literary styles, but I think he also explored different moods. We don't get too much of a sense of Dogen as a personality. He's such a high-minded literary or philosophical figure or leader of meditation. But in the poetry writings, I think you get a little more sense of the personality, which is complex, and aware of the complexity and aware of the contradictions that he's going through, and we get a record of that. So I'll stop here for any questions. Yes?
Do you have any idea at all how long it would take to walk from Kyoto to the site where Eiheiji was? And,
Yeah.
And did Dogen himself walk back at the end of his life, or did someone carry him when he was so sick?
Yeah, I've thought about those questions. And you know, we saw this scene in the film where they had those wood backpacks. You know, so travel by foot wasn't, you know, we're burdened by that as well. And you know, when Dogen went to China, there's a famous saying that he said, "I came back empty-handed," meaning I didn't bring a lot of scrolls and relics and all the paraphernalia with me. But he brought a lot of knowledge with him. But we have to imagine that he probably did bring a lot of text, because he couldn't quote all those texts. You know, we talked about the concordance issue. I mean, he couldn't have the fingertip control of all that unless he had some of the materials in front of him. So somehow he or his entourage. But you know, I'm not quite answering your question yet. But you know, when he went to China, he was with a small group of monks, but they weren't prominent figures in China. They were very low level. They were outsiders. They were foreigners. So he wouldn't have had a lot of help, and he would have been on foot traveling around China a good bit. Although he didn't go a great distance into the inland of China, like one of his predecessors 4 centuries before, Kukai, had done. He still, you know, walked around quite a bit. Now, going up to Eiheiji, basically I've asked that question of colleagues in Japan, and you know, I get anywhere from 2 to 3 days to you know, more like 10 or 12 days. It probably, I'm assuming it took probably a couple weeks up there and back. Coming back as a prominent figure, would he have been carried along? I mean, I think that's likely, but you know, I couldn't really say for sure. But you know, that reminds me of a comment I want to make about the film for people who've seen the whole film. This is the next to last episode, and then the next episode in the film, the final episode, the film shows him on his deathbed, and they leave out 5 years. And during those 5 years, he did a lot of work. He was still working on the Shobogenzo, he was still giving sermons, he produced some other literary accomplishments. And so I think that's one of the weak parts of the film, I think, because it makes it look like, okay, the Shogun thing didn't work out, and now he's dying. And so I request them to add another scene in between.